Welcome back to the Microsoft Research Summit. I hope that you managed to get a bit of a break. For the second part of the New Future of Work track, we're going to be taking a step back and looking at what the research says about how hybrid work is going to change the organizations we work for and the world we live in. And here to provide some context for the first post-break session, which is on how organizations thrive through disruption, is Dr. Ed Doran. So Ed is Senior Director and Technical Advisor here at Microsoft Research. Throughout his career at Microsoft, he's been responsible for incubating new products across various product teams, and even now, while in Microsoft Research, he continues to lead product management for a portfolio of new projects. So Ed, what can you tell us about the Thriving Organizations session we're about to see?
Thank you, Jamie. We're really excited to be here, and the Thriving Organization session is going to be very interesting. You said something earlier that really resonated with me. When we think about the size of the disruption that's happened over the last year, it's not just the impact it's had, but it's the opportunity to create something more positive in the future. And so we've been spending time working closely with community leaders, business leaders, partners to understand how they build resilience during these challenging times. And we've had a lot of conversations around how do I anticipate the new future of work? How do I absorb the challenges that are coming my way? But we also want to talk about how we adapt to the new normal. That is, how do we create organizations that not just survive, but thrive in the new world? So today we're going to start by talking about 5 key questions. First, what has the research taught us about thriving organizations? There's a rich research literature in organizational science. But then, what has the last year done to challenge that research? What new insights have we brought in? What things are very durable and helpful to us? And then the question becomes, how do we act upon that research? So if you imagine a CEO, she's got to make decisions. How does she manage her organization? How does she know what's happening? So we ask, what tools are available to us? And so we have new breakthroughs in machine learning that can offer new things to help decision makers. And then, of course, we've got to drill in and talk about the individual. What is the role of an individual in a thriving organization? How do we deal with things like loneliness? How do we think about burnout? And so we'll talk a little bit about not only the individual's opportunities within the organization, but how the organization creates a system to support individuals to thrive. And then, of course, we're researchers, so we're going to want to talk about where we go from here, the new research that might be available, the new questions we're going after. It's going to be a great conversation.
Those sound like really important questions, Ed. Can you tell us a little bit about the people who will be helping answer them?
Oh, absolutely. This is an area with a tremendous amount of interest in the academic community as well as the industrial one. So I rounded up a good group of friends to help us, but we wanted an interdisciplinary panel. We have Dr. Nancy Baum, who's a celebrated author and expert in communication technologies and relationships here from Microsoft Research. We have Jonathan Larson, founder, researcher, and DARPA alum, with deep expertise in machine learning from Microsoft Research. And we have Dr. Constance Hadley, author and expert in organizational behavior from Boston University. Please join us for the Thriving Organizations portion of this track as we discuss what we know, what we can do, and how we can develop thriving organizations together. Hello, and welcome to the Thriving Organizations panel. Thank you for joining us today. We've been spending time talking about the new future of work, how we can anticipate the changes that are coming, how we absorb the challenges that we encounter. But for this discussion, we want to pivot forward and think about not about anticipation and absorption, but really about adaptation. How do we adapt to the new normal and create organizations that not only survive, but will thrive in the new future of work? So to do so, we're bringing together some good friends who are experts in both organizational science and computer science, specifically graph analytics and machine learning. And we're going to have a great conversation where we'll first begin by discussing the principles of a thriving organization, and then we'll dive into the details with the panel. With that, it's going to be a lot of fun. Nancy, take it away.
Hello, my name is Nancy Baym, and I'm delighted to be here today to speak on the topic of organizational thriving. I'm going to draw on my own work, that of my colleagues in our New Future of Work initiative here at Microsoft, and decades of research to offer a high-level, research-driven set of ideals for understanding organizational thriving now and into a future with more kinds of workers and more kinds of organizational arrangements. Now, you might think with the pandemic still thriving, threats of climate change ever less abstract, people worldwide suffering, and too many organizations of too many kinds failing, languishing, or barely getting by, this might seem like an odd time to think about thriving. Why focus on thriving in a time of crisis? It's a fair question. The last year and a half have been horrible for many organizations. One study found that 225 million jobs were lost globally in 2020. As of June this year, every US state has lost more than a quarter of its small businesses, many considerably more. Why talk about thriving now? Because the pandemic has made it so clear how systemic inequities of our societies have been ingrained in our structures of work. Furthermore, around the world, those with choice are leaving jobs in which they're not thriving, a shift that has been called the Great Resignation, or more optimistically, the Great Reshuffle. Now is the time to build better organizational futures. In this short talk, I'll posit 5 principles of organizational thriving, and I'll end with a critical challenge about how we might bring computational methods to measure and enable thriving. First, I want to ground the discussion by defining both organizations and thriving. It's tempting to think of an organization as a noun or an entity. The term implies structure and coherence, often recognized in formal designations of roles, rules, and responsibilities. Yet, as Carl Weick argued in his 1969 classic, The Social Psychology of Organizing, that entity emerges from communicative processes of organizing. Organizations are constituted through communication, as scholars like Linda Putnam and Ann Nicotera have taught us. This means that organizations are inherently relational. They are results of and impetus for connections between people so they can make things happen together. If we think of organizations as an ongoing process of organizing that's both driven by and create systems that enable collaboration and connection, then thriving is about building relationships that make those within them and affected by them more invigorated than they are apart. Thriving organizations must attend to individuals, but they need to think in terms of systems, including those of which they're part. This future of work calls on us to see thriving as happening through everyday practices that strengthen connections between people in the organization, between the organization and the communities from which it draws and which it impacts, and between the organization and the environment. When I talk about thriving and what follows, I'm indebted to more scholars than I can even begin to cite here, and I want to acknowledge that any talk this brief necessarily oversimplifies and that other experts would offer other perspectives. Think of the principles I'm offering here as one set of research-driven ideals to guide us as we build the new future of work. So first, thriving organizations are resilient and sustainable. COVID-19 and accelerating climate disasters have shown the need to plan for the unexpected. Expanding an organization's capacity to adapt in the face of crises means large-scale preparedness planning. But as Rebecca Langnick-Hall and colleagues showed, it also demands daily habits of awareness of how things are going, questioning whether things are working the best they can, and a willingness to experiment and to change. Sustainability and resilience are also about an organization's relationships with the communities and environments in which they operate. Recent business decision-making interviews conducted by my colleague Adam Coleman at Microsoft indicate that companies are expanding their own understandings of sustainability to include employee health, corporate health, and a much stronger societal responsibility than before. It's a long-standing finding in interpersonal communication that people are most satisfied in relationships that they see as equitable, and organizations are no different. Equity means that everyone in an organization has the opportunity to participate fully, and that when they do, they get out of it what they put into it, regardless of their identity or status. As Ruha Benjamin reminds us, equity is not just about representation, it's also about who gets to imagine the future, and who gets to live in the future of others' imaginations. Like everything else about organizations, equity is both ephemeral and structural. Western State Center's anti-racist organizational assessment identifies 7 areas in which processes can be assessed for equity, including decision-making, budget, revenue sources, accountabilities, location, membership, culture, and programs. The third principle I want to share with you is that people in thriving organizations share understandings and norms. They share their values, they have norms for behaviors that instantiate those understandings. Leaders have essential roles to play in creating and disseminating a shared vision that conveys a positive and constructive sense of values and purpose. They are responsible for ensuring that those values are carried through in institutional systems and processes. But if we think in terms of organizing rather than organization, we see that everyone in organizations has a role to play in normalizing supportive behaviors like problem solving, collaboration, flexibility, mentoring, and inclusion. Gretchen Spreitzer and her colleagues talk about thriving in organizations as feeling energized, alive, and able to pursue personal flourishing through work in alignment with the organization's goals. The pandemic has shaken many people's sense of flourishing, and organizations have proven themselves systematic sources of both support and harm for their workers. Thriving employers strive to improve work experiences and life balance by offering flexibility and autonomy. They support thriving by trusting and investing in opportunities and resources for those who work for them. The trick going forward will be to balance autonomy and flexibility in diverse workforces with the interdependence and shared sense of responsibility that leads to effective teamwork. We're seeing in our recent work here at Microsoft that among the most important individual differences are those in preferred work, media use, and social styles. While some yearn to return to the office to restore balance, just as many yearn to stay home for the same reason. While some savor office chit-chat, others find it distracting. While some find turning video on helps them focus, others find it doesn't. I began by arguing that organizations are comprised of communication, which occurs always within relationships. The relational environments that create and are created by organizations are crucial to all I have been discussing. Thriving organizations foster relational orientations that create supportive partnerships between coworkers and supervisors, between employees in the organization, and between those within the organization and those outside of it. We can think of this from a bird's eye macro level, taking in a whole organization and even its relations with the outside of it all at once. Current work by Jonathan Larson, who will be with us in a minute, Long-Chi Yang and others, looking at billions of data points, show that the pandemic changed communication patterns in ways that led to more siloing within organizations. We can also think of this at the micro level, asking what's happening in those moments when people do connect with one another. Recent survey work I have been doing shows the benefit not just of supportive colleagues, but of organizations that value, teach, and reward people for the relational labor of supporting each other. This is in keeping with a body of research showing that conversations in thriving organizations are civil, supportive, and inclusive. This doesn't mean that everyone needs to be friends with their colleagues, although having one good friend at work is an important predictor of positive outcomes, but it does mean that all employees feel a sense of psychological safety, knowing that they can take risks, seek information, ask for help, offer critical feedback, and be themselves without being penalized or marginalized. As Connie Hadley, who's joining us on a panel shortly, says, unless everyone is safe, no one is. Thriving is always a work in progress. I've argued that thriving organizations are constantly assessing themselves and striving to improve. That implies data collection and analysis. In closing, I want to consider the relational implications of measurement. Most of the work on which I've drawn uses methods such as interviews, case studies, and surveys, methods that entail informed consent. But we're in a time where automated collection of data traces is being used to measure workplace performance on an unprecedented scale. Recent work I've mentioned from folks like Jonathan Larson, Long-Chi Yang, and colleagues here at Microsoft shows the potential to make sense of what's happening in organizations on incredible scales. On the one hand, this offers an opportunity for organizations and workers to assess how well they're doing on the systematic and individual aspects of thriving to which they aspire. But research shows time and again that workplace surveillance undermines workers' experience and autonomy, a burden disproportionately shouldered by people of color and those who work in poor-paying jobs. So I want to close with a few questions. How might evidence of thriving or its absence, as I've outlined it, be seen in data traces or imputed from them? How can such measurement be done in ways that honor the trust and autonomy central to thriving? How can we ensure that automated collection of digital evidence is consensual, privacy respecting, safe, and more rewarding for those whose data is collected than for those who collect it, lest measurement undo the very thriving it seeks to assess? Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. That was a great way to sort of frame up our conversation today. Why don't we start at the higher level? For members of our audience, how do we know if we're thriving or what thriving might look like for their organization?
It's a super hard question. Super hard question. And I've laid out my ideas in the talk that you just heard based on my read of the literature. But, being realistic, we're talking about many, many scholarly fields that have been working for a very long time. And I think there's a lot of different perspectives on it. I'm sure Connie has one to offer as well, which I'll look forward to hearing. For myself, I think that the key thing about thriving is that it's not just that you're doing fine as a business or as whatever goal it is that your organization has organized in order to do. It's that through this organization, people's communities, the organization as a whole, people's teams, the relationship with the environment, all of those things are improving as a result of what's happening within that organization. So for me, thriving is really about going beyond doing really well, making a profit and so on, to contributing to flourishing on a scale that has significant impact for those you employ and affect. What do you think, Connie?
Well, thank you. Like you, Nancy, my definition is evolving and definitely rests on the shoulders of many who have come before in terms of conceptualizing what it means to work and what it means to be a thriving organization. I love your definition because I think it's a really complex one that will take some time to really flesh out in terms of how to operationalize it, measure it in organizations. Mine is a little bit simpler, maybe because I can only think of three things at once. But I really think about it more as the three elements that relate to what makes for a high-performing team, I think are really equivalent to what makes for a really high-performing organization. So the first part is to deliver effective work products and services. And so I like the fact that you're saying they are doing fine as a business. I wouldn't want to lose sight of that. I think realistically, to convince any senior executive that this is worth pursuing, we need to confirm that they will still be able to deliver on the goals and the promises that they make to their stakeholders. But then the second one would be whether each individual person themselves is learning and growing. I do believe there's a fundamental human need to self-actualize, to continue to get better and to learn. It's an intrinsically rewarding experience. And not all organizations put a primacy on that. And I wish more would, because I think that really is a key to a thriving organization. And then the third element is whether the organization is keeping its members intact and committed to one another. And that's partly about culture, and it's partly about the relationships that are built within the organization. And so this is equivalent to, you could have a team that wins the championship and every person's skills got better, but they hate each other and they want to abandon the team as soon as the game is over. We don't want that either. We want organizations to actually be able to weather, I know you talk about resilience, we want them to be able to weather the next storm and the next challenge that comes by having a group of people who are staying committed to themselves and to the organization.
So just to chime in on top of that, I think that from my perspective, I've been looking at this kind of from a data-driven perspective in terms of how the companies are changing. And so to me, one of the mechanisms I think of when I think of an organization thriving are the covariates that would then emit from that as well too. So for example, if you're to take a look at the impact of a mergers and acquisitions or a reorg or something like that, can there be measures of like productivity or attrition or happiness or other sorts of surveys that we might be able to use to help look at the metrics and see how those might be predictive of the particular outcomes in that particular vein?
Thank you, Jonathan. I think that's really helpful. What I wonder now is, not only is there this rich literature about what a thriving organization is, but how has that been applied in the last year? So what has the last year really taught us about our definition of thriving? What might be new insights, or what might be fundamentals that come to be all the more important in this changing environment?
I can start with this one. I would say for me, I've learned over and over again how important trust is. It's a word that's thrown around a lot, often, casually and maybe not as respectfully as it should, because I think trust really is at the core of what lubricates the workings of an organization. And I have seen too many companies throughout the pandemic lose their employees' trust and squander whatever they had built up before by doing things that alienate them, that exclude them, that you've given an example, Nancy, from your talk before about surveillance. This notion of watching employees has come up again and again as an example of when managers don't trust that the people out of their line of sight are still doing their jobs well. And I have yet to meet an employee who has told me that that's what they're doing. If anything, they're working harder than ever to prove how much they are working, even when they're out of line of sight. But on the other hand, I talked to so many executives, particularly in the middle and early parts of their career, who were thinking about leaving their organization now and joining this great exodus from American and worldwide knowledge work. And I think a lot of it is because they themselves don't give enough trust towards the organization itself, enough to actually try to work it out, try to find a new role or a change in the schedule or a change in the team in some way that would allow that person to continue to, as I said before, grow and thrive within that organization. So the trust has to go both ways. And without it, I think there's just too much working at cross purposes and often inadvertently undermining each other.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about trust. And trust to me speaks to relationship, right? And the centrality of having a relational orientation, like I talked about. And I do feel like that's one of the things that's become really clear in the last year and a half. Since, as somebody who comes from communication, to now hear people talking about social connection so frequently in terms of work. And I think that so much of what was taken for granted about the processes through which people connect in organizations that form that coherence to whatever kind of organization it is was kind of invisible and taken for granted. And then when we got disrupted in all of our various ways, it became very visible that connection is so critical. And whether that's the technologies that we're using to connect with one another or the practices that we're using those technologies to do, it's just so clearly at the heart of what it means to be continuously organizing into an organization. What do you think, Jonathan?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, really building upon that point that you're talking about, the technology that people use to kind of communicate with one another, I think that's one of the biggest areas that I really kind of learned in the research of looking how the pandemic actually affected things. As people moved from working in the office to working from home, with that, we saw that they really changed the modalities of communication. I mean, you could see a huge rise in the use of instant messaging type platforms like Teams, for example. And so to me, that was kind of a real aha moment, a light bulb to actually see like how people were working before. The hallway conversations now getting translated into the digital realm. And I think that moving forward, we're also going to have some real challenges as people start moving towards a hybrid work posture as well too. Because previously everything was presumably in person. Now everything moved to everything being remote, and now we're going to have some in person, some remote, and that's going to put potentially people at a severe disadvantage if especially the people are meeting in person, and then there are some who are also remote. And so some of those communications that were all previously remote and talking to one another, and some of those move to being in person again, that might put a disadvantage to people who are hybrid, but then also still remote at that point. So we have to be very careful about how we're thinking about the modalities of communication, whether it be through instant message, meetings, emails, and whatever other mechanisms people might be using.
So that's a really interesting point, Jonathan. Maybe you could expound a little bit more, because let's step in and look at the individual. So what happens to individuals in these situations where there is stress within the organization?
Well, I think one of the most notable things that we found is that human communication seems to have a natural range of observed modularity, or like small world network, because people have a limited capacity due to the amount of time they have to actually be able to engage meaningfully with a certain group of people. And this really tends to manifest itself in the form of siloing. And we actually saw this over the course of the pandemic, that once the pandemic hit, we saw a lot of the organizations, enterprises really became a lot more siloed. And I don't mean siloing in a bad way. I mean just siloing as a descriptive sense. Siloing can be good because it can be pointing towards a loose coupling of these groups with tight alignment. That would be the very good scenario of it. It could also be bad. I mean, it might be forming very brittle relationships between organizations, and in the worst case, perhaps gang wars between those organizations. And so you don't want those types of things to happen. And so what we observed is that these siloing scores have tended to go up as people started to work more remotely. And I'd like to think that's really pushing more towards this looser coupling with the tighter alignment type of strategy.
It's so interesting to me that asked about individuals right away, you shift, Jonathan, to talking about the connections between them. And to me, that's always where the most interesting stuff lies, even as it's much harder to target connection than it is to target individuals. It seems to me, I worry sometimes that too much responsibility is being put on individuals. So, for example, you have companies offering wellness programs, which is great unless the wellness is needed in order to recover from what the company is doing to you, right? So I think that organizations have a responsibility to not create situations that are that individuals then need to go away and get better from. And I think that individuals can't be asked to bear all the responsibility of making organizations thrive, because organizations themselves are systems and are structures, and they do push people in particular directions. So I value the focus on individuals. At the same time, I think that we're pretty good at thinking about individuals, and we're not as good at thinking about the systems that connect individuals to each other within organizations.
I would love to pick up on that, because this is a kind of a common refrain that I have with the organizations and executives that I speak with. I'll give an example. This summer, I was talking to a group about burnout and loneliness in organizations. And at the end of the talk, the CEO said, "Yes, this sounds terrible, but why is this my problem to solve?" And I said, well, I mean, objectively, each person in your organization is responsible for making connections to stave off loneliness, for managing their work and their schedules to prevent burnout. But at the end of the day, if you think of these as worker problems and not workplace problems, you're missing an opportunity to have a massive impact on the whole employee base that you're working with. So why push the responsibility down to that individual level when there's so much more that can be done at the group and the organizational level? And so, is it an obligation per se? I mean, I don't think so, but it's certainly an opportunity that organizations can take up. And so going back to the siloing point from Jonathan's work, I love the fact that there could be a really positive spin on this, but I worry, based on what I'm seeing, that in fact what we are seeing is people's networks getting smaller, perhaps tighter in a good way. Again, going back to maybe they feel very safe and a real strong sense of belonging in that smaller group that they're spending more time connecting with. But we know that for long-term growth and learning and career potential, that those people need to have a broader network. And so the degree to which they become so dependent on this one small group makes me concerned that they will have less opportunity, less visibility down the line. And also, if they don't have the access to other individuals and they themselves don't feel like they really fit in that whatever that silo they're living in right now, that's a very lonely place to be. And I think it just accentuates it when you feel like you're isolated from the rest of the organization.
Well, Connie, you raise a bunch of really interesting points. One of the things that really stands out to me is this is a dynamic system, right? There are changes to the individual as they grow and evolve and react to what happens around them. And there are changes in the way the system behaves as well. How do we think about how thriving organizations and individuals evolve together as we move forward?
So I can take the first stab at this one. The way I've really been thinking about how the individuals and the organizations evolve is by looking at it from the standpoint of stability. So if you have a company that is experiencing something like a pandemic, one of the things you'll see is that it has to adjust to that, right? So we actually looked at this for the case of Microsoft, and in the case of Microsoft, you looked at stability after the pandemic. It actually took a couple months for it to really hit. Like everything started kind of around March-ish, but it wasn't really until April that a lot of the informal working groups and communication patterns that we observed really started to change massively and kind of reset into a new norm. And so from my perspective, what I really see is an opportunity here to measure at both the individual and at the enterprise level these metrics of stability, so that we can then maybe start better understanding how these might be able to be predictive of other features like happiness, retention, or KPIs of interest.
You talk about dynamism, Ed, and I think that is the key, the back and forth between the dynamic and the structure and the stability, the change in the stability. And for me, this is why I went into communication as a discipline, because I was completely fascinated by the idea that structures don't emerge whole cloth and then they're done. It's not like any organization suddenly materialized and it was complete. Congratulations. And now all the people in that organization do their thing, and the organization is an unchanging container in which they operate. There's always evolution in all ways, right? The organization is changing because the people within it are changing, and the people are interacting, and that's causing change. And sometimes it's going to be really visible things, like the employees walk out to protest something and you have to back off and say, oh, actually, we're going to change the way that we operate now. And sometimes it's super, super subtle, like something gets inserted in the training and it has a little bit of an impact and it ripples slowly across. And so there's this continuous back and forth coevolution. Connie?
Yep.
Yes, I completely agree with this point that it's not like the pandemic suddenly started the need for evolution. Organizations have been evolving over time. I have to say, I'm trying. I know, Nancy, you talked about this as well in your speech, but I really think we should be taking more deliberate advantage of the shakeup that the pandemic has brought to the way work is done. And so just for an example, going back to the loneliness topic, in my research, we were concerned, some of us researchers were very concerned about this before the pandemic, and we were actually doing a worldwide study, my colleague Mark Mortensen and I, that was examining it and finding that people, even though they were working on many teams, many people felt acutely lonely. Then the pandemic hit, and so the companies who think that the return back to the office, even if it's only part-time, is going to solve some of these issues, I think are incorrect. We had been evolving in organizational life to having a more transactional culture, a view of people as being more interchangeable in terms of getting the work done versus the relationship base that I hope the pandemic has made us realize is so critical. Again, going back to what makes an organization thrive in the long term. You can push people very hard to get great work products, or you can give them some isolated training to help their independent learning and growth. But you really want to have those groups that want to sustain together over time, and that requires more effort on relationships. And I'm not in any way glad that any aspect of the pandemic happened. However, I think given that it's happened, we should take advantage of this new interest among many executives in the relationships that organizations have. And there's a big difference between trying to foster relationships and just letting them happen as they will. And I think that the work of Jonathan and Nancy and the rest of you at Microsoft Research, you have the advantage of this tremendous database and the algorithms and the artificial intelligence required to look at those patterns over time. So I want to really harness that so we can show that, all is not well, beneath the surface. People are struggling. They are in these isolated silos and pockets, and we can throw them a lifeline and get them back into the fold.
That's a great point, Connie. And I think it leads us to the conversation of where do we go from here? We certainly don't want to try to go back to the old normal, but we want to go to the next better. So as we start to think about the future, what comes next?
Well, I think we're going to have to be a whole lot more intentional about things. Jonathan pointed to the challenges we're going to have around hybrid meetings when some people are co-present and some people are not. And that's, there's a long history of research on remote workers, but that always assumed that they're a special category of worker. And it's not a very happy literature, right? It doesn't show a bunch of thriving employees who feel like they belong. It's quite the opposite. So I think the question is going to be, how do we instill a sense of relationality and belonging and inclusivity and hold on to that with intentionality when we are really going to have very, very different arrangements of not just workers present and co-present, but I suspect that in the next decade, we're going to have really different kinds of organizations and really different kinds of workers. We have now so many people who are doing on-demand work or consulting work or work that is not about being employed by a single employer. And I think we're going to have to think about what about all of those people? There's tons and tons and tons of them, and this conversation can't go on as though they don't exist.
Mhm.
Yeah, totally agree, Nancy. I think just to add to that, my thoughts are really just really thinking towards tools and metrics and capabilities that we can learn from the data. But I think that as we do that, though, we also need to be extremely mindful about building tools in a privacy-preserving way that empowers the employee so that people can't be individually singled out by the corporation, but such that we can still provide utility at the corporate level to help provide health to that organization. So one of the tools actually that we released a couple months ago is a tool inside of Viva Insights, inside of Azure Templates or Organizational Network Analytics. And that's just one tool of many potential tools that really can help us democratize these types of capabilities and measuring the observed impact as we look at the metrics and these outcome variables to really understand how is the new future of work changing and what are the things we can actually do to improve the future of work for employees of the future. Yep. Connie, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I think that's great. First of all, I would just make one. I want to talk about my other vision of the future, but just pick up on your point about privacy, Jonathan. So I do a lot of speaking about psychological safety, which is having an environment in which employees feel it's safe to take interpersonal risks. And that means anything that could possibly have blowback on them and their reputation or their success or perceptions of them in the firm. And one of the points I make to leaders is that if you have a psychologically safe environment, you shouldn't need anonymous surveys. So thinking about privacy, when there is no safety, I feel that the privacy needs to be of utmost concern, and the ways that you are able to take anonymous data and camouflage it so that people are protected. But I think the goal is to actually not have to do that. I think the goal is to have an environment in which the data can be transparent and people willingly share it with their names on record so that it does symbolize this sense of, I can tell it to your face, this is how I feel, or this is how your behavior has been affecting me. It may be, this is maybe too idealistic on a massive scale, but at least on a local level, that's what I would aspire to. And I do a lot of work also talking about, feedback and how to get feedback. And it's hard to hear it as the manager as well. But I think if we get into more regular practice of collecting that data with people on record and seeing that something good can come of all that openness, that would be, my ideal. So combine the power of data with the power of those interpersonal trust-based relationships. And then the second thing I wanted to just say is, so anyone who's ever done an interview study with me knows that eventually I get to the magic wand question. And I always like to just sort of let people imagine, if you had a magic wand, what would you do? So I'm going to take full liberty with this question, Ed, and assume you've asked me if I had a magic wand. If I did, I really think the first step I would do would be to reduce the absolute level of work that's being done and expected right now, and myself included. I think that we have gotten so good at being efficient and getting work done that we've forgotten that there's a whole other set of, positive benefits to not working, and we can, including to the time to build real relationships, to go back to having coffee with people without any agenda, the chance to go out, after work for dinner, or just the chance to be with our family and our friends more. I see a lot of companies. I study global companies where they're so proud of the fact that they now have workers in every time zone, so the work never has to stop. And I think, gosh, that's super efficient, but also like kind of depressing, because it just means that you've basically said that every single second of every day should be spent working by that setup. And so I would love to see organizations take a big step back and say, what can we reduce? What can we slow down? what are the things that we can do to take things off people's plates? And of course, right now we're in a catch-22 because with all the people quitting and leaving, those people who remain are getting twice the work. And so I don't know how to, that's why I need the magic wand. I don't know how to actually make that happen right away, but I would love that as an aspiration, because I think with more time and ability to breathe, more of this thriving stuff could really happen. And by the way, I'll put a caveat that doesn't mean that people take a huge pay cut either. I would love to figure this out in a way so that people can still support themselves and their families, and those who are not getting paid a fair wage are able to do and participate in that kind of living wage as well.
See, this is what I love about this conversation is when you have experts from organizational science and machine learning, we get to talk about psychological safety and privacy-preserving technologies. We talk about the principles of organizations. In reality, we also talk about the dynamics of the systems that we work in. We talk about the groups, we talk about the individuals. I'm sure there's more research that we could cover, but I do want to open up the floor a little bit and ask for sort of some final thoughts from each of you, because I know there's more publications, more research on the way. But as we round up today, what are some of the final thoughts you really want to share with our audience? We have this wonderful group of researchers, developers, business decision makers watching us now. What do you want to share with them coming out of this discussion?
Sure, I'll jump on this one first. So the first observation is that organizational behavior has changed during the pandemic. I think that's pretty obvious to everyone. And so we need better tools to actually understand how that change is actually impacting the new future of work. And I think that really we just need to start aiming for those goals of like those looser coupling, tighter alignment, that optimistic side of the world, and trying to figure out how we can actually better operate in that sort of setting in this new hybrid environment that we're returning to. And I think there's just a lot of opportunity space there moving forward.
Great.
Connie?
First of all, I also agree. I think hybrid work. I've taught all in person. I've taught all remote. And I got to tell you, hybrid teaching, which is the equivalent of having a meeting with some people in the room and some people in the room, is absolutely the hardest thing that I've ever done professionally. So I think there's a lot we need to learn and test to get good at hybrid work. But I also want to sort of pick up on this idea of, is this an inflection point? Is this an opportunity for us to do things differently? And I think we have to make no assumptions that we know exactly what the right way forward is for thriving organizations. I think we need to get into an experimental mindset where we do lots of thoughtful, scientifically based experiments. So, for example, any organization who's already made their return to the office plan for the next indefinite period, I think is making a mistake. Maybe try for 6 months, try for a year, see what happens. But along with that, I think we need to have more data collection, more measures. And so really trying to understand what is blocking us from thriving. And again, I think, Jonathan and Nancy, your work is going to give us lots of promising indicators that we might chase down to say, both as leading in terms of, time-based intervals, the things that might come before, but also things that just are on the surface that we can measure more easily than the deeper levels of thriving that may be harder to get at right now. So thinking about what's on the surface and also what might be back in time that might be good predictors would be useful. And then finally, I just think that organizations vary in shapes and sizes, so there is no one size fits all solution for any of this. But almost every organization can get their arms around a smallish group or a team or a series of teams. Part of my bias is I'm coming for the micro side of organizational behavior, which means I focus on like the individual level versus the big macro social systems kind of level. But, for me, I think that going back to like the psychological safety point, like we can get our arms around the people that we can know in a deep way in our organization. And so I would start with measuring those groups. I'd also start with the experiments at that level. And of course, you want to have organizational coordination as well. So I'm not saying that they would be rogue. But I think rather than waiting for this great solution that's going to come down from above, it's like, let's start a little bit closer to the ground. Let's try a bunch of stuff. Let's try to be as scientific as we can about measuring without losing the human side of the work as well. And I think that's where not just quantitative data collection, but qualitative data collection in the forms of interviews, focus groups, essays, diary entries, things like that could be really useful.
I think measurement is in many ways the big question going forward. I mean, you've heard me talk a bit about organizational responsibility rather than individual responsibility, and I think measurement is tied up in this. I disagree with Connie that a trusting relationship should exclude privacy. I think that privacy is a really valuable thing within many trusting relationships. And I think it's also really important to recognize that the kind of data that folks like Jonathan are working with includes a lot of stuff that you didn't think of yourself as communicating about. It's what Goffman would call information given off, like what time you sent an email, rather than information given like, hey, boss, I'm sending an email at 11:30, thought you'd like to know. So I do think that privacy is critically important. And I think that we've seen over and over that technologies designed for one purpose get used for other purposes, and all the best intentions behind them create monsters. So I do think there's incredible opportunity here to hone in on these things like loneliness and happiness, and to figure out ways to bring together these huge macro scale metadata studies with qualitative inquiry. I think I'm really excited about that micro-macro fusion that can happen. But I do think we need to be incredibly cautious as we develop these technologies, because we're seeing over and over that what's happening in the workforce right now en masse is measurement being used to make sure people are staring at the screen all the time and not taking breaks, and are being really almost imprisoned by the surveillance technologies around them. So I think that we have to recognize that is the technological environment that we're operating in, and that if we want to do good, and I do believe that we can do good, we have to really understand that environment and be, again, incredibly intentional, and as Connie said, experimental also, to figure out what works and what doesn't work, and not jump in all the way and then have to drown. Terrible last word, sorry. Don't drown if you want to thrive.
Well, but I love what the team is saying, where we're talking about we don't know the right answers yet, but we have a rich academic literature that we can drive into that can help guide us and help us ask the right questions. We have new tools and new fields coming to the fore, to Jonathan's comments, that help us measure whether we're making the right decisions. And we have principles that we can drive to, that idea that thriving is part of everyone in the organization, that we have to think about individual thriving as well as organizational thriving in this dynamic state. It's a fascinating conversation. This is what happens when you get friends together from different fields. I know we're a little out of time, but I'm glad we touched on all of these things. I am sure there's more research on the way. I think there's probably some new publications that are on the way out too. So we'll look forward to that. But we thank you very much for spending your time with us today.
Thank
we
you,
hope
Ed.
everyone in the audience enjoyed it and enjoys the rest of the summit. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.